The wind howled through the Chicago night, carrying with it a biting chill that froze everything it touched. Snowflakes fell in relentless waves, blanketing the streets in an unforgiving white. At the edge of the city, a sprawling estate stood isolated, its towering iron gates barely visible through the storm. Inside, Michael Donovan's mansion was a world apart, warm and imposing, yet suffocating in its emptiness. Michael sat alone in his grand study, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting long shadows on the mahogany walls. A crystal glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him, untouched. He gazed out at the storm through a frosted window, his reflection staring back at him like an old adversary. The years had not been kind. Bitterness etched deep lines into his face, his once vibrant eyes dulled by the weight of loss. The fortune he had built seemed meaningless in the absence of anyone to share it with. He was pulled from his thoughts by a faint movement on the security monitor. The screen, positioned discreetly in the corner of the study, displayed an unexpected sight. A figure, small and fragile, slumped against the gate. Michael frowned, his initial instinct one of irritation. People often wandered too close, drawn by the mystery of the mansion, but this seemed different. The figure wasn't moving. Moments later, bundled in his overcoat, Michael stepped into the blizzard. The cold bit at his face as he approached the gate. There she was, a young woman, her clothes insufficient for the weather, her lips blue from the cold. He hesitated, caught between his usual guarded nature and a strange compulsion to act. "Hey!" he called out sharply, his voice cutting through the wind. No response. He knelt down and gently shook her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, a mixture of fear and exhaustion meeting his. "You can't stay out here," he said curtly, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Come inside. Just for tonight." She hesitated but nodded faintly, too weak to argue. As Michael guided her toward the mansion, a thought struck him. What am I doing? Yet something about her frailty stirred something buried deep within, a flicker of the humanity he thought he had long since abandoned. Inside, the warmth enveloped them both. For the first time in years, the mansion was no longer just his. The warmth of the mansion wrapped around Emma as she stepped inside, her trembling frame still reluctant to shed the cold that clung to her. Her eyes darted across the space, wide and cautious, taking in the soaring ceilings and polished floors. The contrast between her tattered coat and the gleaming luxury around her was stark. Michael noticed the way she hesitated at the threshold, her hand lingering on the doorframe as though she feared stepping further might break some unwritten rule. "This way," he said gruffly, motioning her forward. His tone was brisk, businesslike, as if to mask his own discomfort. He led her down a quiet corridor to the kitchen, where the hum of modern appliances broke the silence. Reaching into a cupboard, he retrieved a blanket and tossed it over a chair. "Wrap yourself in that," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "I'll make some coffee." Emma complied silently, draping the blanket around her shoulders and tucking it close. She sat with careful precision, as though the chair beneath her might crumble under her weight. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. Michael worked in terse silence, pouring steaming coffee into a mug and placing it before her. She cradled it in her hands, savoring the warmth, but still said nothing. Her quiet demeanor made him uneasy. She didn't fit into any of the neat boxes he liked to categorize people into. No pleading, no overly grateful theatrics. Just quiet, understated composure. "You don't look like you belong out there," Michael said finally, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't exactly gentle either. Emma met his eyes, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion lining her face. "And you don't seem like someone who usually opens his doors to strangers." The response was quick, sharp in its honesty. For a moment, Michael was taken aback. There was no pleading in her voice, no attempt to gain his sympathy, just a quiet dignity that unsettled him. "Well," he muttered, pushing off the counter, "this isn't a charity. You can stay the night. After that, we'll figure it out." Emma inclined her head slightly, her gratitude clear despite the words she didn't say. As she sipped her coffee, Michael lingered by the door, feeling a strange unease. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The soft strains of piano music drifted through the mansion, pulling Michael from his restless sleep. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The melody, delicate and melancholic, seemed out of place in the silence that usually enveloped the house. Rising from bed, he followed the sound, his steps slowing as he approached the sitting room. There, seated at the grand piano that had belonged to his late mother, was Emma. She played with a careful touch, her fingers gliding over the keys in a way that suggested both familiarity and restraint. Her profile was illuminated by the pale morning light streaming through the tall windows. Michael lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. The piece ended, the final notes lingering in the air before fading into silence. Emma looked up and froze, catching Michael's gaze. Her hands hovered above the keys as if caught in a forbidden act. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Michael raised a hand to stop her. "It's fine," he said, his voice neutral, though his expression betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Confusion, perhaps, or an old wound resurfacing. "Where did you learn to play?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to the piano. "An old church I used to stay in had a broken one. I'd practice when no one was around." Michael nodded, stepping into the room. "That was my mother's. She used to play it every morning." "I'm sorry," Emma said quickly, her voice quieter. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have." "I said it's fine," he interrupted, though his tone softened. "Just don't break it." Emma allowed herself a small smile. "I'll be careful." The moment passed, and Michael folded his arms. "Look, about last night. You can stay here a little longer, but I'm not running a shelter. You'll need to make yourself useful." Emma met his gaze directly, her composure unshaken. "I understand. I'll do whatever I can." "Good," he said, though her calm acceptance made him feel oddly off balance. "We'll figure the rest out as we go." As the day unfolded, Emma began organizing the kitchen and tidying rooms Michael hadn't touched in years. She moved with quiet efficiency, offering no complaints. Still, when Michael tried to probe her background, she sidestepped his questions with practiced ease. By evening, Michael found himself replaying the morning's music in his mind. Emma's presence, so unexpected, was already reshaping the silence he'd grown accustomed to. He wasn't sure if that was comforting or unsettling. For now, he chose not to dwell on it. The mansion had always been too large for one man. Every corner of its vast expanse seemed to echo with reminders of what had once been. A vibrant home filled with laughter and warmth. Michael stood in the library, his gaze fixed on the rows of untouched books lining the shelves. He had always liked this room, but now it felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. Memories crept in unbidden, his ex-wife's voice soft and teasing, as she rearranged books while he protested, pretending to care about the order. The family gatherings they once hosted in this very house, now long gone, leaving only the stillness behind. The silence had become a constant companion, one Michael had learned to live with, though it often weighed heavy. He turned his attention to the faint sounds coming from the kitchen. Emma. Over the past day, she had moved quietly through the mansion, organizing spaces Michael hadn't bothered with in years. The clatter of dishes and the occasional soft hum of a tune he didn't recognize filled the air. It was strange, hearing signs of life again. Walking toward the kitchen, he paused in the doorway, watching as Emma carefully scrubbed a countertop. Her movements were efficient, purposeful. Though she worked silently, there was an air of calm determination about her. "You don't have to do all this," Michael said, his voice breaking the quiet. Emma turned, startled, but quickly composed herself. "I don't mind," she replied, her tone steady. "It's the least I can do." Michael nodded, unsure how to respond. The sight of her, so composed despite her circumstances, stirred something in him, though he couldn't quite place what. "Why are you so?" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "So what?" Emma prompted, her head tilting slightly. "Resilient," he said finally. "Most people would have given up by now." Emma's gaze dropped for a moment, but when she looked back at him, there was a quiet strength in her eyes. "Giving up never seemed like an option," she said simply. Michael lingered, watching her resume her work. He found himself wondering how someone with so little could carry so much dignity. The thought unsettled him, though he didn't know why. As he walked away, the mansion seemed less cold, less empty. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be alone. That realization lingered, more persistent than he cared to admit. The moon hung low in the winter sky, casting its pale glow over the snow-covered streets. Michael adjusted his coat against the biting wind as he stepped out of the mansion, trailing a figure he had been watching all evening. Emma had slipped out the side door quietly, her thin frame barely discernible in the shadows. He didn't know why he followed her. Curiosity, suspicion, or perhaps something else he couldn't name. He kept a safe distance, his footsteps muffled by the snow. Emma moved with purpose, clutching a small bag to her chest. She navigated the icy streets with a familiarity that puzzled him. Finally, she stopped in front of a modest building. The faint sign above the door read, Haven Shelter. Michael lingered in the shadows, watching as Emma stepped inside. Moments later, she emerged without the bag, her face illuminated by a brief smile as she exchanged words with someone at the door. The sight struck him. He had never seen her smile before. Not like that, genuine and unguarded. When she turned to leave, he stepped forward. "You've been busy," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. Emma froze, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious resolve. "You followed me?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with wariness. Michael shrugged, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I was curious. Thought you might be up to something." Her brows furrowed, but she didn't look angry, just tired. "And what do you think I'm up to?" she asked. He gestured toward the shelter, dropping off food in the middle of the night. "That's not exactly normal." Emma let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's normal for people who know what it's like to go hungry." Her words landed harder than he expected. She stepped closer, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I didn't take anything from your house, if that's what you're thinking. The food came from what I had when I arrived. I couldn't keep it to myself." Michael stared at her, searching for something to say, but the weight of her words silenced him. For years, he had measured worth in terms of possessions, status, and self-preservation. Emma's simple act of kindness exposed the hollowness of that perspective. "I wasn't accusing you," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good," she said softly, stepping past him. "Then you can walk me back." As they made their way through the snow, Michael felt a strange unease, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a crack in the walls he had built so carefully. The fire crackled softly in the sitting room as Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Michael leaned back in the armchair across from her, his gaze fixed on the flames. The snowstorm outside had worsened, cocooning them in the mansion's quiet warmth. It had been hours since they returned from the shelter, and while the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was thick with unspoken words. Emma broke it first. "You must think I'm strange," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. Michael looked over, his brow furrowing. "Why would I think that?" She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I just showed up at your gate, and now here I am, sitting in your house like I belong." Michael's expression softened, though he said nothing. He had thought her presence strange at first, still did, in some ways, but now it felt less intrusive, more grounding. Emma stared into her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I didn't always live like this, you know, on the streets." He waited, sensing that this was something she hadn't shared often. "My mom died when I was 16, she continued, her tone steady, though there was a flicker of pain in her eyes. "It was just the two of us. After that, everything kind of unraveled. I tried to keep things together, but I was just a kid." Michael listened, surprised at how much he wanted to know more. Not out of curiosity, but because every piece of her story felt like a step closer to understanding her resilience. "I bounced around," Emma said with a shrug. "Foster homes, shelters. Eventually, I just stopped hoping things would get better." "Why?" Michael asked quietly, leaning forward. She hesitated, her gaze meeting his. Because hope can be a cruel thing when it doesn't come through. Her words struck a chord. Michael knew that cruelty well. He had felt it after his divorce, after losing his family. It was easier to bury those feelings than to confront them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Emma tilted her head, studying him. "What about you? You don't strike me as someone who's had an easy life, despite all this," she said, gesturing to the luxurious room around them. Michael hesitated, the walls he'd built around his past pressing in. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose something you can't replace." Their eyes met, and in that shared vulnerability, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Michael felt a pang of something unfamiliar, something that made him realize Emma was becoming far more than just a guest. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, golden light across the room. Michael sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture relaxed but his mind restless. Across from him, Emma perched on a cushioned ottoman, her knees drawn up as she absent-mindedly traced the rim of her empty mug. The mansion was unusually quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that demanded reflection. "You were good at the piano," Michael said, breaking the silence. Emma glanced up, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thanks. It's been a while since I've played on something that wasn't falling apart." Michael allowed a small smile, his fingers brushing against the armrest. "That piano was my mother's. She used to play every morning. It was her way of starting the day." "She must have been incredible," Emma replied softly. "She was," Michael admitted, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She always said music could heal anything. I didn't believe her when I was younger, but maybe she was right." Emma's gaze fell to her lap, and for a moment, the glow of the fire reflected a distant sadness in her eyes. "I always thought music was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did," she murmured. "Even when I had nothing, I could always find an old piano or hum a melody. It felt like home." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why did you stop?" Emma shrugged, the corners of her mouth pulling into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Survival doesn't leave much room for creativity." There was a weight to her words that Michael didn't know how to counter. Instead, he rose from the sofa and walked to the piano in the corner of the room. His fingers brushed the polished wood, dust-free thanks to Emma's recent efforts. "Then maybe it's time to make room," he said, lifting the lid. Emma stared at him, her lips parting in surprise. "Michael, I couldn't." "Why not?" he interrupted, looking over his shoulder. "It's just sitting here. If music helps you, then use it." For a long moment, Emma didn't move. Then, slowly, she approached the piano, her steps hesitant. She sat on the bench and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them. Her expression softened, the weight of the world momentarily lifting as she began to play a soft, tentative melody. Michael watched from the shadows, captivated. The music was imperfect, but there was something raw and beautiful in its simplicity. As the notes filled the room, he found himself drawn closer, the firelight casting flickering shadows across both their faces. When she finished, Emma turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Michael hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because it feels like the first thing that's made sense in a long time." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a fragile thread of connection that neither dared to break. Michael's gaze lingered on hers, but before the moment could deepen further, he looked away, retreating to the safety of distance. "Good night, Emma," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm within. "Good night, Michael," she replied, her tone carrying the same hesitant warmth. As he walked away, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something neither of them was ready to name. Michael leaned back in his office chair, the city skyline sprawling outside the window behind him. The warmth of the conversation with Emma the night before lingered, though it had faded somewhat in the cold, clinical atmosphere of his business dealings. Across from him, Richard Blake, his lawyer of nearly a decade, adjusted his glasses and frowned. "Michael, I don't think you're grasping the potential fallout here," Richard said, sliding a folder across the desk. Your decision to house this woman, no matter how noble it might seem, could be seen differently if the wrong people find out. Michael stared at the folder without opening it. She's not a situation, Richard. She's a person. I'm not disputing that, Richard said carefully. But you know how the media works. A story like this, a millionaire sheltering a homeless woman, won't stay straightforward. They'll twist it, sensationalize it. Questions will be raised about her motives and yours. Michael clenched his jaw, his hands tightening on the armrests. So, what are you suggesting? That I throw her back onto the streets to save face? Richard sighed. I'm suggesting caution. This isn't just about your personal reputation. It's about your business. Shareholders don't appreciate controversy, even if it's baseless. Michael pushed the folder aside, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. Let them speculate. I don't answer to them. Richard hesitated, sensing the growing tension. Michael, he said softly, I've known you for a long time. You've always been pragmatic about these things. What's different this time? Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the window, watching the snow drift lazily past the glass. What was different? He could feel the answer stirring within him, but he wasn't ready to say it aloud. Not to Richard, and not to himself. She's different, he said finally, his voice low but firm. And I'm not going to let fear dictate my choices. Richard studied him for a moment before nodding, though his concern was still evident. Just be careful. People will talk, Michael, whether you like it or not. After Richard left, Michael remained in his office, the lawyer's words echoing in his mind. He had spent years building his empire, carefully cultivating a reputation that commanded respect. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight of it as a burden, not a shield. Back at the mansion that evening, Emma was in the library, organizing the shelves with quiet determination. She glanced up as Michael entered, sensing his unease. Tough day, she asked, her voice light but kind. Michael hesitated before nodding. You could say that. Emma gave him a small smile, and for a moment, the tension in his chest eased. Watching her, Michael realized that the world he had spent his life constructing felt increasingly empty without her presence. But bridging the gap between his life and hers would mean risking everything. And for the first time in years, he thought it might be worth it. The sharp knock at the front door echoed through the mansion, cutting through the quiet evening like a knife. Michael glanced up from his desk, frowning. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. He rose and made his way to the entryway, his steps deliberate. When he opened the door, a man stood there, his dark coat dusted with snow. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of entitlement that grated instantly. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over Michael before narrowing. I'm looking for Emma Carter, the man said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge that set Michael on alert. Michael's expression hardened. Who are you? Jason Hill, the man replied, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I believe she's been staying here. I'm her fiancé. The word struck like a blow, but Michael didn't let it show. She didn't mention you, he said, his tone even but guarded. Jason's smile tightened. We've had our disagreements, but I'm here to take her home where she belongs. Michael's instinct screamed at him that there was more to this story. Wait here, he said curtly, closing the door before Jason could respond. He found Emma in the sitting room, her hands busy folding a blanket. She looked up as he entered, and her face instantly registered his unease. There's someone at the door for you, Michael said, his voice low. Jason Hill. He says he's your fiancé. The blanket slipped from Emma's hands. Her face drained of color, and her breath quickened. He's here, she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael stepped closer, his voice steady. Who is he, Emma? Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to Michael. He's not my fiancé. He's controlling, dangerous. I left him months ago. I didn't think he'd find me here. Michael's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest. Stay here, he said firmly, turning to leave. No. Emma grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You don't understand. Jason doesn't give up. He'll twist things, manipulate you. Please, don't. Michael met her panicked gaze and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Emma, trust me." He returned to the door, opening it just enough to face Jason again. "Emma doesn't want to see you," he said bluntly. "You should leave." Jason's demeanor shifted, his polite mask slipping to reveal something darker. "I don't think you understand. Emma is my responsibility." Michael stepped fully into the doorway, blocking Jason's view of the interior. "She's not your responsibility anymore. Now leave, or I'll call the police." Jason's eyes flickered with anger, but he took a step back. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. Then he turned and walked back to his car. Michael closed the door, locking it firmly before turning back to Emma. She was standing in the hall, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's gone," Michael said gently. Emma nodded, but her voice was barely a whisper. "He'll come back. He always does." Michael approached her, his voice steady and filled with quiet resolve. "Then we'll be ready. I'm not letting him hurt you." For the first time, Emma let the tears fall, and Michael stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said softly. Her gaze met his, and in that moment, the fear in her eyes was matched by something else, gratitude, and perhaps a glimmer of trust. Though the storm had passed for now, Michael knew Jason's shadow loomed large. But for the first time in years, he felt a fire inside him, a determination to protect someone who mattered. The morning light filtered weakly through the mansion's windows, illuminating the sitting room where Emma sat curled up on the edge of the sofa. Her knees were drawn to her chest, and her gaze was distant, fixed on the untouched mug of tea on the coffee table. Michael stood nearby, leaning against the doorway, watching her with a mix of concern and frustration. "You're thinking about leaving," he said, breaking the silence. Emma flinched slightly, her head turning to meet his eyes. "It's for the best," she replied, her voice low but firm. "Jason won't stop. If I stay, he'll just keep coming after me. And after you." Michael pushed off the doorway, walking into the room. "And if you leave, do you think he'll stop chasing you then?" "Running won't solve this, Emma." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket draped over her legs. "It's not just about me. You've already done so much for me, Michael. I don't want to bring more trouble into your life." He let out a sharp breath, pacing to the other side of the room. "You think I care about the trouble? If I didn't want to deal with this, I wouldn't have stood up to him last night." Emma's eyes filled with emotion as she shook her head. "You don't understand. Jason doesn't fight fair. He'll find a way to hurt you, your reputation, your business. He'll destroy everything you've built." Michael stopped pacing, turning to face her fully. "I don't care about any of that," he said, his voice steady. "What I care about is you." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Emma's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to respond but faltered, unsure of what to say. Michael moved closer, his presence grounding her in the storm of her thoughts. "Emma," he said softly, crouching so that they were at eye level. "I know you think leaving will protect me, but it won't. All it'll do is put you in more danger. Jason's not going to stop because you disappear again. He's going to stop when we make him." Her eyes welled with unshed tears, but she bit her lip, determined not to let them fall. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Michael reached out, his hand hesitating for just a moment before resting gently over hers. The touch was warm, grounding, and filled with unspoken meaning. "Let me decide what risks I'm willing to take. I'm not letting you go through this alone." Emma stared at their hands, her resolve wavering. For so long, she had relied only on herself, convinced that depending on others would only lead to disappointment or betrayal. But Michael's unwavering gaze, his steady presence, made her wonder if it was possible to share her burden. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll stay." Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. "Good," he said, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Because I wasn't going to let you leave anyway." For the first time in days, Emma laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension like a beam of sunlight through storm clouds. The moment wasn't dramatic or grand, but it was powerful in its simplicity, a shared understanding that neither of them would face what lay ahead alone. As the day moved forward, Emma began to feel something unfamiliar. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep running anymore. And as Michael watched her settle back into the mansion's rhythm, he realized that protecting her wasn't just about courage. It was about holding on to something that mattered deeply. The study was quiet, save for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Michael sat at his desk, reviewing a series of documents he'd asked Richard to dig up regarding Jason Hill. The deeper he dug into Jason's background, the more unsettling the picture became. A man with deep connections to powerful, shady networks. It explained Jason's relentless pursuit of Emma, but it didn't explain why she had become his target in the first place. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Michael called, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his chest. Emma stepped inside, her expression hesitant. "You wanted to see me?" Michael gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit," he said, his tone gentler than his words. She did, folding her hands in her lap as she waited. "I've been looking into Jason," Michael began, leaning forward slightly. "There's a lot about him that doesn't add up. But I think you know that already." Emma's jaw tightened, her eyes flickering with something between fear and defiance. "What are you trying to say?" Michael hesitated for only a moment. "Why is he after you, Emma?" "The truth this time." She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "It's not just about me leaving him," she admitted. Her voice was quiet, but the weight of her words filled the room. "It's about what I know." Michael's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma exhaled shakily, her gaze meeting his. "When I was with Jason, I found things. Documents, emails, things that showed he was involved in some serious corruption. Money laundering, bribery, even threats against people who got in his way. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "You exposed him?" "I tried," Emma said, her voice steadying. "I went to the authorities with what I had, but Jason's connections run deep. The case was buried, and suddenly, I became a problem he needed to eliminate." Michael stared at her, the implications settling heavily. "And now he's hunting you because you're a loose end?" Emma nodded, her expression weary. "I've been running ever since." The room fell silent, the tension between them palpable. Michael felt the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. He had thought protecting Emma was a matter of standing up to a dangerous man, but this was far more complicated and far more dangerous. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't want to drag you into this," Emma replied. "You've already done more for me than anyone ever has. I didn't want you to lose everything because of me." Michael's gaze hardened. "You think I'm worried about my money?" "You should be," Emma said sharply. "Jason won't just come after me. He'll use everything he can to destroy you if you're in his way." Michael rose from his chair, walking to the window as he processed her words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and unyielding. He turned back to her, his expression resolute. "I don't care about the risks," he said. "You don't deserve to face this alone." Emma's eyes widened, her breath catching at the conviction in his voice. "Michael." "No," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll figure this out. Together." For the first time in years, Michael felt the fire of purpose reignite within him. This wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. It was about standing against something far greater, and he was ready to face it head-on. The mansion felt unusually still that evening, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Emma stood by the window in the library, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out into the swirling snow. The weight of everything she had shared with Michael pressed heavily on her chest. She had spent so long running, hiding, that opening up felt almost unnatural. Vulnerability wasn't something she allowed herself often, or easily. Behind her, the soft creak of the door signaled Michael's arrival. She didn't turn immediately, but she felt his presence as he stepped inside, the warmth of his closeness cutting through the chill in the room. "You've been quiet," Michael said, his voice low but steady. Emma glanced over her shoulder, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a lot to take in. For both of us," he agreed, stepping closer. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." She looked back out the window, the snow blurring the landscape beyond. I'm not used to this, she admitted, to having someone who cares. Michael's chest tightened at the rawness in her voice. He moved to stand beside her, his hands resting in his pockets. Neither am I, he said softly. Emma turned to face him fully, her brow furrowing. Why are you doing this, Michael? Why risk everything for someone like me? He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. Because you're not someone like you. You're Emma, and I've spent too many years closing myself off from the world. You make me want to be better. The sincerity in his words broke through the walls Emma had so carefully built. She blinked back the sting of tears, her breath catching. You barely know me. I know enough, he said, his voice growing firmer. I know you're brave, even when you're terrified. I know you're kind, even when the world hasn't been kind to you. And I know that I haven't felt this alive in years. Not until you showed up. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as she searched his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Just quiet certainty and something deeper, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. Michael, she began, her voice trembling, but he cut her off gently, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give, he said. I just need you to know that you matter. To me. Emma didn't know who moved first, but suddenly they were closer, his hand cradling her face as their lips met in a kiss that was as tender as it was intense. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the steady reassurance of his presence. When they finally broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing as she tried to steady her breathing. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Michael said, his hand slipping down to entwine with hers. But we'll get through this. Together. The word hung in the air between them, a promise that felt as fragile as it was unbreakable. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. They stayed there for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the background. Michael's thumb brushed over the back of her hand, a small but grounding gesture that spoke volumes. As the night stretched on, the chaos of the outside world faded, leaving only the quiet strength of their connection. It wasn't the end of their struggles, far from it, but for the first time, they faced the uncertainty not as two broken souls, but as a team bound by trust, hope, and something that might just be love. The tension in Michael's office was palpable as Richard stormed in, his face pale and drawn. Michael, seated behind his desk, looked up sharply at the intrusion. Michael, we've got a problem, Richard said, throwing a folder onto the desk. A big one. Michael opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. His jaw tightened as he realized what he was looking at. Internal memos, private correspondence, and even details about his dealings with Emma. It was all neatly compiled in a dossier. Where did this come from? Michael asked, his voice low and controlled, though his anger simmered beneath the surface. It's already in Jason Hill's hands, Richard replied grimly. One of your associates sold you out. We're not sure who yet, but this information, it's damaging. Michael closed the folder, his mind racing. The betrayal was a gut punch, not because of the potential damage to his reputation, though that was significant, but because it put Emma in greater danger. Jason will use this to tighten the noose, Richard continued. He's already pushing for a legal case against you, claiming you're harboring Emma as part of some scheme. Michael stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. We'll deal with it, he said firmly. But first, we need to find out who leaked this. As Richard nodded and left to investigate, Michael sank back into his chair, the weight of the betrayal settling heavily on his shoulders. He had trusted his inner circle implicitly, until now. Later that evening, Michael shared the news with Emma. She listened in silence, her face growing pale as he recounted the details. When he finished, she spoke quietly but firmly. We can't fight this alone, she said. Jason's reach is too wide. Michael sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I know, but who can we trust? Emma hesitated before answering. There's someone I know. Someone who might help. Who? Michael asked, his tone wary. Her name is Caroline Matthews, Emma replied. She's a journalist. I worked with her briefly when I first tried to expose Jason. She's tough, and she hates him almost as much as I do. If anyone has the resources to counter him, it's her. Michael considered this. Caroline Matthews was a name he recognized, an investigative journalist known for her fearless pursuit of the truth. She had once exposed one of his business rivals in a damning article, and he had respected her tenacity ever since, even if they had never met. Do you trust her? Michael asked. Emma nodded. She won't risk her reputation without evidence. If we can give her something solid, she'll take it from there. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line before he finally nodded. Then let's bring her in. The following day, they met Caroline in a nondescript cafe downtown. She was sharp-eyed and direct, wasting no time on pleasantries. You've got guts coming to me, she said, her gaze shifting between Michael and Emma. But guts won't win this. You need proof. Michael slid a USB drive across the table. This is everything we have on Jason. Financial records, witness accounts, and communications Emma intercepted. Caroline picked it up, inspecting it before meeting Michael's eyes. This is dangerous, she said. Jason won't go down without a fight. Neither will we, Michael replied. Caroline's lips curved into a faint smile. All right, I'll dig into this. If it holds up, Jason's days are numbered. As she left, Michael turned to Emma. This is a gamble. Emma nodded, her expression resolute. But it's one we have to take. Despite the betrayal that had threatened to unravel them, Michael and Emma now had an unexpected ally. The battle against Jason was far from over, but they were no longer alone in the fight, and for the first time, hope felt like more than just a fleeting possibility. The evening sky was a muted gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Michael and Emma sat in the quiet comfort of the library, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. The mansion felt warmer now, not just because of the flames, but because of the shared energy that filled the space. An unspoken connection forged through the trials they had faced together. Michael poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Emma before settling into the chair across from her. She accepted it with a small nod, her gaze drifting to the fire. It feels strange, Emma said after a moment, her voice soft. Sitting here, in this calm, knowing what's coming. Michael took a sip of his wine, his eyes fixed on her. You've been running for so long. I imagine stillness feels unnatural. She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. It does. But it's not just that. She looked up, meeting his gaze. You've changed everything for me, Michael. I don't know if I would have been brave enough to face this without you. Michael set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. You give me too much credit. You were brave long before I showed up. Emma shook her head, a hint of emotion in her voice. I've survived, yes, but I don't think I've truly lived in years. Not until I met you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Michael felt his chest tighten, his heart wrestling with emotions he hadn't let himself feel in so long. You've changed me too, he admitted. I spent so much time closing myself off from the world, convinced that it was easier to be alone. But you reminded me what it's like to care about someone. Again, Emma smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I'm scared of what's coming, Michael. But for the first time, I'm not scared of standing still. Michael reached across the small table, his hand finding hers. Their fingers intertwined, and in that simple touch, they found reassurance. Whatever happens, Michael said, his voice steady, we face it together. The storm outside began to pick up, the wind howling faintly in the distance. But inside the mansion, in the quiet glow of the fire, Michael and Emma found a moment of peace, a calm before the inevitable storm. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators, journalists, and legal teams filled the space, their hushed murmurs creating a tense undercurrent. Emma sat beside Michael at the defendant's table, her hands clenched in her lap. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her, but Michael's steady presence beside her kept her grounded. Jason Hill entered the room with his legal team, exuding confidence. His smirk, aimed directly at Emma, sent a shiver down her spine. Michael noticed and leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "Remember, you're not alone." Emma nodded, drawing strength from his words. She glanced at Caroline Matthews, who sat a few rows behind them. The journalist had spent weeks combing through the evidence Michael had provided, turning it into a damning expose. Jason's crimes were no longer secrets, but his ability to twist narratives and evade consequences made this confrontation pivotal. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The hearing began with Jason's lawyer launching an aggressive attack. They painted Emma as a manipulative figure who had latched onto Michael for protection while running from her own poor decisions. Every word was designed to discredit her, to make her look small and unworthy of the support she'd found. Michael's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed, knowing their moment to speak would come. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he rose and adjusted his tie, walking to the stand with measured confidence. The opposing lawyer wasted no time, trying to entangle him in questions about his decision to house Emma, insinuating ulterior motives. "Mr. Donovan," the lawyer sneered, "you expect us to believe this was an act of altruism? A man of your wealth and influence, taking in a homeless woman out of the goodness of your heart?" Michael's gaze was unwavering. "I didn't take Emma in out of charity," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I took her in because she needed help, and I had the ability to provide it. If that's hard for you to understand, maybe that says more about you than it does about me." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as the lawyer faltered, momentarily thrown off by Michael's directness. When Emma was called to the stand, her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. Jason's lawyer wasted no time hurling accusations, attempting to unearth anything that could discredit her. "Miss Carter," the lawyer began, "you claim to have evidence of Mr. Hill's wrongdoing, yet for years you remained silent. Why should the court believe you now?" Emma met the lawyer's gaze, her voice steady despite the tension. "Because I was scared. Jason has a history of silencing people who get in his way, and I knew what he was capable of. But that doesn't make what I'm saying any less true. And now, thanks to the people who stood by me, I'm not afraid to tell the truth anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jason's confident smirk faltered. Caroline had been right. Truth had power, and Emma's courage in speaking it turned the tide of the room. The culmination came when Caroline's investigative report was presented. It detailed Jason's illegal activities with irrefutable evidence, financial records, anonymous testimonies, and a paper trail that painted a damning picture. Jason's team scrambled to counter, but the weight of the evidence was too heavy to dismiss. Still, Jason wasn't done. As the court adjourned for a recess, he approached Michael and Emma in the hallway. His voice was low, but the venom was unmistakable. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? You don't know what you're up against." Michael stepped between Jason and Emma, his stance protective. "The difference between us, Jason, is that I'm not afraid of the truth. You should be." Jason's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a bailiff intervened, ushering him back toward his team. By the end of the day, the judge announced that Jason would face formal charges based on the overwhelming evidence. The victory was monumental, but it came with consequences. Michael's public association with the case had sparked media frenzy, putting his reputation and business under scrutiny. Shareholders called for his resignation, questioning his judgment and priorities. When they returned to the mansion that evening, the weight of the day pressed heavily on both of them. Michael poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "I've put everything on the line," he said quietly, "and I'd do it all again if it meant keeping you safe." Emma stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. "Michael, I didn't want you to lose so much because of me." He turned to face her, his expression soft but resolute. "I didn't lose anything that mattered. What I've gained, helping you, standing up for what's right, that's worth more than any amount of money or approval." Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Michael reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You already have," he said simply. The storm outside raged on, but inside, there was a sense of peace. Together, they had faced the worst Jason could throw at them, and they had prevailed. But more than that, They had found something in each other that neither had thought possible: hope, trust, and a shared belief in a better future. The mansion felt hollow in Emma's absence, its grandeur reduced to a suffocating silence. Michael stood in the library, staring at the piano where Emma had once played, the notes of her tentative melodies still echoing faintly in his mind. Her departure had been sudden. No note, no explanation, just the empty space she had left behind. He clenched his fists, frustration and worry coursing through him. He replayed their last conversation, searching for clues. She had seemed quiet, distant even, but he had chalked it up to exhaustion after the trial. Now, he realized it was something far deeper. Michael grabbed his coat, determination hardening his features. He knew Emma well enough to guess where she might go. Despite her resilience, she carried a lifetime of self-doubt and fear, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone. The snowstorm had eased, leaving the city under a heavy white blanket. Michael drove through the quiet streets, his mind racing. He had checked the shelters where she once sought refuge and spoken to Caroline, who had no idea of Emma's whereabouts. Finally, he remembered Emma's stories of an old church, her sanctuary during the hardest times. The church was modest, its weathered stone facade blending into the snow-covered surroundings. Michael pushed open the heavy wooden door, his breath visible in the cold air. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the faint smell of candles and aged wood enveloping him. Emma was there, sitting in the front pew, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against an invisible cold. She didn't look up when Michael approached, but her shoulders tensed as his footsteps echoed through the empty hall. "You left," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with equal parts relief and frustration. Emma didn't turn, her gaze fixed on the altar. "I thought it was for the best." "For who?" Michael asked, stepping closer. "Not for me," she sighed, her voice barely audible. "For you. For your business, your life. I've done nothing but bring chaos into it." Michael sat beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "You think I care about any of that?" "You should," she snapped, finally turning to face him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Michael, you've sacrificed so much for me. Your reputation, your company. It's too much." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Undeterred, he leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. "Emma, listen to me. I didn't make those choices because I had to. I made them because I wanted to. Because you matter to me." Her lip quivered, and she looked away, her walls crumbling under his words. "I don't know how to be with someone who sees me like that." "Then let me show you," Michael said, his hand finally finding hers. "We fought so hard to get here, Emma. Don't let fear take that away from us." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I'm scared, Michael, of what happens if I stay. Of what happens if I let myself believe this is real." He cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Being scared doesn't mean we give up. It means we fight harder. And I'll fight for you. For us. Because I know this is real." Emma closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight of his words, the strength of his conviction. When she opened her eyes, there was a flicker of something new: hope. "You really believe we can do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "I believe in you, Emma, and I believe in us." She exhaled shakily, her hand tightening around his. "I'm tired of running." "Then stop," he said simply, "and stay with me." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Emma allowed herself to believe in their possibility. She leaned into Michael, her forehead resting against his, and whispered, "Okay." They stayed in the church for a while longer, the silence now comforting rather than oppressive. When they left, the world outside seemed brighter, the snow glittering under the streetlights like tiny stars. Back at the mansion, the warmth of the fire greeted them as they stepped inside. Emma paused in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the room that had once felt foreign and now felt like home. Michael stood beside her, his arm brushing against hers. "Welcome back," he said softly. Emma smiled, the first genuine one in what felt like days. "It's good to be back. As they settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening, Michael realized that this wasn't just a triumph over Jason or the obstacles they had faced. It was a triumph of trust, of love, and of the belief that even in the darkest hour, they could find their way back to each other. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge delivered the final verdict. Jason Hill stood at the defendant's table, his once smug demeanor now replaced by a hardened scowl. The evidence Caroline Matthews had unearthed had been irrefutable, exposing the depth of his corruption. When the gavel came down, announcing his conviction, a collective breath was released by those who had been fighting against him for so long. Emma sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly together. Relief washed over her as the weight of Jason's shadow lifted at last. Beside her, Michael placed a steady hand on her arm, his silent reassurance grounding her in the moment. It was over. The battle they had fought together had finally reached its conclusion. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. The media frenzy surrounding the trial gradually died down, though Michael's business faced challenges as a result of the public scrutiny. Shareholders had questioned his judgment, but Michael's transparency and resolve to maintain his values had won over many. One crisp winter morning, Emma joined Michael in his office, a newspaper in hand. She set it on his desk, the headline bold. Hill convicted. Whistleblower and team bring justice. It's official, Emma said, her voice light with relief. Caroline's story is everywhere. People are starting to talk about what happened. Michael looked up from his work, a faint smile touching his lips. It's not just Caroline's story, he said. It's yours. Emma's expression softened, but a thoughtful shadow crossed her face. I've been thinking, she said, sitting down across from him. There are so many people out there who don't have the resources or the courage to fight like we did. I want to help them. Michael set his pen down, his interest peaked. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, Emma admitted, but maybe I can use what I've been through to advocate for people in similar situations. Help them find their voice? Michael nodded, admiration evident in his gaze. Whatever you need, I'll support you. Emma smiled, gratitude and determination lighting up her face. Thank you. Meanwhile, Michael found himself addressing parts of his own life he had long neglected. The trial and its aftermath had forced him to reflect not only on his relationship with Emma, but also on the fractured relationships of his past. One afternoon, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Michael? His sister, Laura, said, surprise evident in her tone. It's me, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to talk. There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. I didn't think I'd hear from you again. Michael swallowed hard, the guilt of years of silence pressing down on him. I've been avoiding a lot of things, but I want to fix this. If you'll let me. Laura's voice softened. I'd like that. The conversation wasn't long, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Michael felt the possibility of mending the bond with his family. Emma's advocacy work began to take shape, starting with small steps. She partnered with local shelters and organizations, sharing her story to raise awareness about the challenges faced by survivors of abuse and those struggling to rebuild their lives. Her passion and authenticity quickly drew attention, inspiring others to join her cause. One evening, as she prepared for an event, Michael watched her with quiet admiration. You're incredible. You know that? He said, his voice filled with warmth. Emma turned, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. I'm just doing what feels right. And making a difference, he added, stepping closer. Don't downplay that. Emma smiled, her eyes meeting his. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Michael shook his head. You would have found your way. I just gave you a place to start. The bond between them had deepened over time, evolving into a partnership built on trust, respect, and love. The mansion, once cold and empty, now felt alive, filled with shared laughter and quiet moments of connection. On a snowy evening, months after the trial, Michael and Emma stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out at the frost-covered grounds. The world seemed still, almost serene, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. Feels like a lifetime ago, Emma said, her voice tinged with wonder. The night I showed up here. Michael chuckled softly. You mean the night you turned my world upside down? Emma glanced at him, her eyes sparkling with humor. You needed it. Maybe I did, he admitted, his tone growing serious. You've changed everything, Emma. Not just my life, but how I see the world. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. And you've shown me what it means to truly feel safe, to be loved. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. Then Michael turned to her, his expression thoughtful. Emma, he began, his voice steady. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want to face it with you. Her smile widened, her grip on his hand tightening. I think we've proven we can handle anything, Michael. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. Inside and out, the mansion was no longer a place of isolation, but a home filled with hope, purpose, and the promise of a new beginning. The mansion was alive. It wasn't the life of bustling parties or extravagant displays. It was quieter, more profound. The warmth that now filled its halls came not from the roaring fireplaces, but from the love and purpose shared by Michael and Emma. The once cold home had become a sanctuary, not just for them, but for their shared dreams and newfound family. Emma stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase. The morning sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating her with a golden glow. She had transformed in the months since the trial, still resilient and strong, but now with an ease in her movements, a peace she hadn't known in years. Michael leaned against the doorway, watching her with a soft smile. You know, I could get used to this, he said, his voice warm. Emma looked up, her lips curving into a playful grin. You mean me taking over your kitchen and rearranging everything? I mean this, he said, stepping closer and gesturing around them. The way this house feels now, like a home. Emma set the vase on the counter, her gaze meeting his. That's because you let it be one, she said gently. You opened your life to something new. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I had a little help with that. They shared a quiet laugh before Michael tugged her toward the living room. The grand piano stood in its usual place, but now it bore signs of frequent use. Open sheet music, a metronome perched on the corner. Emma had made it her own, filling the mansion with melodies that matched the rhythm of their days. Play something for me, Michael urged, his tone playful. Emma raised an eyebrow, feigning reluctance. You're just trying to get out of helping with the flowers. Guilty, he admitted, grinning. She sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. The notes flowed effortlessly, filling the room with a soft, lilting tune. Michael sat nearby, the music wrapping around him like a warm embrace. Watching her, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for her presence, but for the way she had changed him, broken down his walls, and shown him what life could be. When the music faded, Emma turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her blush. What? She asked, laughing lightly. Just wondering how I got so lucky, he said simply. Emma's smile softened, and she stood, walking over to him. You stopped fighting what was right in front of you, she said, her voice tender. And so did I. They sat together on the couch, the fire crackling softly in the background. Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped box. Emma looked at him in surprise. What's this? She asked. Just something I've been meaning to give you, he said, handing it to her. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate silver locket. Her fingers traced the intricate design before she opened it. Inside was a photo of her and Michael, taken one snowy evening on the mansion's balcony. Michael, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I wanted you to have something to remind you of how far we've come, he said, of everything we've built together. Emma closed the locket, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped it around her neck. She looked at him, her eyes shining. It's perfect. Thank you. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their journey hanging between them. It wasn't a burden, but a testament to their resilience, their ability to face the worst and come out stronger. What do you think's next for us? Emma asked eventually, her head resting on his shoulder. Whatever we want it to be, Michael replied. We've faced the impossible and won. The rest is ours to shape. Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and determination. She thought about the work she had started, the lives she hoped to touch, and the future she was finally ready to embrace. The snow began to fall outside, the flakes swirling gently in the wind. Michael pulled her closer, his arm draped around her shoulders as they watched the world transform into a winter wonderland. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with shared dreams, quiet contentment, and the unspoken promise of a life they would face together. As the fire burned low, Emma turned to Michael, her voice soft but firm. "You saved me." He shook his head, his lips curving into a tender smile. "No, Emma, you saved me too." Their hands intertwined, and in that moment, the world outside ceased to matter. The mansion, once a place of loneliness and regret, now stood as a testament to love's redemptive power, a beacon of hope for what was and what could be. The future was unwritten, but they would face it together, unafraid and unshaken. And for the first time in their lives, peace felt not like an ending, but a beginning. Love and courage transform lives. Have you ever thought about the connections that could change yours? Don't miss the next videos. Follow the channel and get inspired.